Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. This is going to be the second in the two-part series of talking to you about the control of mites in the hive. The last video I did was about the intervention, in other words, the treating of mites to get mites out of the hive when they were becoming out of control. Today I'm going to talk more about the prevention. The prevention of mites can be done with what we call integrated pest management techniques, IPM. Integrated pest management techniques use a variety of different ways of slowing down the buildup of mites by some removal and some removal of the opportunity for the mites to reproduce. And so integrated pest management techniques are an excellent tool, several excellent tools to help slow down that buildup of mites. And that's what we're looking to do, is eventually just not have many mites in the hive. And the slower we can have mites build up, the better our bees will be. This is particularly important if you're of the opinion that you are planning to go for a non-treatment type method of managing your bees. If you're a beginner, I urge you to consider your options. To put it mildly, I would say that you're far better off learning how to keep your bees alive and including in your arsenal the opportunity to treat for mites, rather than trial and error and finally working out a way in which you finally get your bees to live, because this might take you many seasons and many hives if you simply use integrated pest management techniques to control mites in your hive. Because all they'll do, they will slow down the buildup of mites, but eventually just about every hive will get to the point at which they will need intervention or the colony will die. So I urge you to recognize techniques for controlling of mites first before gradually adopting your ideas of a less treatment intensive method. I admire those who wish to get a totally treatment-free method of keeping their bees. I think ultimately that will help result in a far better bee for us. But knowing the biology and the genetics and the time scale involved and the cost involved, it's something that's very hard to do on a private scale. I would look at your options first, so don't jump straight in as a beginner into non-treatment techniques. Look at how most people keep their bees alive, those that do, because most people don't keep their bees alive. Look at how those that are successful in keeping their bees alive do it. That includes integrated pest management techniques and the appropriate treatments at the times when those treatments are required. So let's have a look at what options are available to us. Okay, this is a good way of explaining integrated pest management techniques. So we're going to look at a pyramid here of different options open to us. We'll divide it into 4. Now, what we have down on the left-hand side here is preventative. This is where I'm going to make spelling mistakes, probably because I am a terrible speller. This is prevention and intervention. And when we're talking about intervening, we're also talking about adding toxic chemicals in. So the further up this pyramid we go, the more toxic or more poisonous the treatment is, the more we're intervening in the life of the bees. But down here in the prevention area, we have a lot more, we can fit a lot more options into this triangle than we can in that triangle here. So we've got these different categories. let's start at the bottom here. We can look at reducing the reproduction of the mites. And that we can look at a few options, which I'm going to explain shortly. But it includes resistant broodstock of our bees, small cells of the comb, and breaking of the brood cycle. And we'll come and go back over these various options. Now we can have mites killed by physical means. This might involve mite trapping, such as drone brood removal. I could talk about screened bottom boards for the mites to drop out of the hive. And we can accelerate this with powdered sugar. So you may want to come back to this triangle after I've gone through the second part of this video, where I'm going to show you these various categories here, and then you may want to go back and see how these fit into the picture. So then we have natural compounds, and that's going to include things like thymol. These are various treatments we can use, also known as Apilife var or Apigard. There's formic acid, oxalic acid, and hops beta acids. Which we talked all about these in the last video. And then finally, you've got the synthetic. These are the most toxic of the treatments. Things like Apivar, Amatraz, I believe. So these are the options that we have. This is sort of the integrated pest management side of things here, these lower scale ones, which give us options, but these preventative methods are a little less effective. The further up we go up the scale, the more impact it has on killing mites. So let's go over and outline some of these things in particular. We went through treating the hives with hops, with oxalic acid, with formic acid and thymol in the last video. I don't use synthetic treatments myself. I use what we call organic treatments. These are the ones that I use here. But the synthetic treatments are also available. The problem is the synthetic treatments are tending towards having more and more instances where mites seem to be becoming immune to their effectiveness. So as we mentioned, that weird life cycle of the mites, these synthetic treatments are starting to show more and more signs of resistance, and we've had to get rid of quite a few different synthetic treatments in the last decades because of those the evolution of those mites and how they're evolving different strategies of coping around it. But we're going to talk about these integrated pest management techniques. Okay, first of all, before we go into these techniques, we're going to just go over again the need to sample your bees. As you're going to be using a treatments which are not going to wipe out the mites, all of these things are going to slow down the buildup of mites. They will not be an effective means of controlling the mites. I can't make that any clearer. Do not rely on just these methods for controlling your mites. And to demonstrate when these methods are becoming inadequate, because they will become inadequate, you should do your sampling of mites. And just to make sure that, just in case you didn't see the other video, let's go over that one more time. Sampling of mites is very important. If you can do it, you are going to be on top of the mite situation in the hive. I'd recommend trying to sample your mites in your hive every month through the year, from the spring right to the last time you're able to play with your bees. I talked about in the last video having a fallback position, that if you're uncomfortable sampling bees or you feel incompetent at sampling the bees, there is a fallback position which I talk about in the previous video of having a regime, a treatment regime which you're planning to use anyway. Sampling is a much better method of determining when you need to treat. I tend to use this as a means of, based on my previous experience, the sampling will tell me if I don't need to treat yet. But work on the assumption that when you have a sample, if you've got 3 hives in your yard and one of them is showing mites at the threshold level, it's time to treat all 3 hives. You don't have to sample every single hive. As soon as you have a sample which indicates high levels of mites approaching, it's time to treat. So when you are sampling your bees, what you're looking for is a brood frame. In the brood chamber, you're looking for a frame with open brood, not lots of capped brood, not lots of honey. You're going to find in the open brood lots of nurse bees. That's the very young bees who've recently hatched out of the brood. They have the most recent representation of what mite levels are like in that brood at the moment. And in that brood is where 85% of the mites in the hive currently are. You take a frame and ideally you make sure, number one, that the queen is not on that frame. Better still, do this immediately after having found the queen in your hive. You're working your bees, you find the queen, say, right away I'm going to sample for mites. Make sure the queen is safely elsewhere. The frame is in the other super. You go through the brood frames, you're looking for a frame with lots of open brood. Not capped brood, not honey, but lots of open brood. You have the brood frame that you need to use. Take that brood frame, shake it above a washing up tub like this. The older bees that are about 3 weeks older will fly out. They're going to go back into the hive, leaving behind the young, few days old, a week old, 2 week old nurse bees who are on that frame looking after brood, but they can't fly yet, or if they did, they wouldn't know where to go. So they stay in this tub, and if you give that a shake, the bees will go down here. You've got your bees in this tub. What you're going to do is ideally you do this before you put the bees in the tub. You get your alcohol and your mite sampling equipment ready first. This is called the Varroa Easy Check. It is basically a plastic tub with a plastic mesh like a spaghetti colander in here, and it's got pre-marked levels to fill up with alcohol. So plain old isopropyl alcohol, fill it up to the lower mark here. Now what you're going to do is shake your bees into the tub. Take a scoop of 1/2 cup, scoop out the bees, and they'll stay in that cup if you're quick. Bang them inside your tub, they fall into the alcohol, the bees die instantly. Now you take your lid, And the reason we're doing half a cup of bees is almost very close to 300 bees. Now what we do is we shake the alcohol all over those bees, and what it's going to do is wash the mites off the bee. The mites will fall off the bee now, they're dead too. The mites fall off, they go through the holes in the little colander there, and now they're in the alcohol floating around underneath. And we can now count how many mites there are in that alcohol. You're shaking it for about 60 seconds, very vigorously, and that gets all the mites off. The threshold for a 300 bee sample is 6 mites. 6 mites is 2% of that 300 bee sample. If you're finding 6 mites or more in that sample, it's time to do one of those more aggressive treatments using oxalic acid, Formic Pro, HopGuard, those sort of treatments. You've now reached that point in the pyramid. If they're below 6 mites in the sample of 300 bees, you still have time. The mites haven't built up enough yet. Work on the assumption they will do, so keep on sampling. And if your last sample was, if you're getting 0 in May, 1 in June, 2 in July, chances are you're going to have 3, 4, 5 or 6 in August and 10, 20, 30 in September if you don't do anything. We want to make sure they stay below 6. So that's the sampling. Okay, so now that we've done our sampling, let's look at the different tools we have at our disposal for integrated pest management techniques. Screen bottom board. The screen bottom board, as opposed to a solid bottom board, provides an area where if you take this tray out, the bees are always grooming, and occasionally they will knock a mite off themselves and it'll drop to the bottom of the hive. On a solid bottom board, the mite will climb aboard another bee. But on a screen bottom board, the mite will drop out of the hive, land on the ground below, usually be eaten by an ant, or at least have a very difficult time getting back up into the hive. So a solid bottom board, a screen bottom board, can be very useful. Typically, when I start up the hive, I will have the tray in to keep things warm. But as we start getting into warmer weather, June, July, August, I'll take that tray out altogether. So the screen bottom board will slow down that buildup of mites in the hive. Screen bottom boards are known to reduce mite levels in the hive by about 15%. That means they're not going to reduce the mite altogether, but they're going to slow down that buildup by approximately 15%. You can actually accelerate the drop of mites from those frames by, when you've done your inspection in the hive, take some powdered sugar. Take a quarter cup of powdered sugar and sprinkle it all over the top bars of the hives. You're going to cover bees down in the brood chamber with a coating of powdered sugar. This is totally harmless to the bees, but the bees are going to spend the next hour grooming themselves. That's going to drop a lot more mites from the brood chamber to the bottom of the hive and out through the screen bottom board. Again, powdered sugar in my classes, unless I can really emphasize this, I'm reluctant to mention it because some people take powdered sugar dusting as a mite treatment. It is not. It's just going to drop the level of mites a little bit. It's going to slow down their buildup. Okay? So powdered sugar can be used in combination with a screen bottom board to keep mites building up slower rather than quickly. Now, here's a way that you can actually reduce a significant number of mites in the months of maybe late May, June, July. This green frame is called a drone frame. And I've mentioned this in previous videos, but you notice that the cells here are quite large. These are drone cells. When the bees build these frames out, they'll build all drone cells. The queen will come across these cells and lay drone eggs in the hive, in those frames. What I've mentioned in the previous video about talking about the life cycle of the mites. Mites will preferentially seek out drone brood because they produce more offspring when they parasitize a drone larvae than they do a worker larvae. So mites seem to sense this. They detect drone larvae. They will preferentially go into this frame. So when this frame is amongst your brood frames, the bees have to invest a fair amount of effort into building up drone cells and feeding and whatnot the drone larvae. But what happens is the mites preferentially go into this frame. When these cells become capped, the mites are trapped in with the drone larvae. You now take this frame out, shake the bees off, put it in a bag, stick it in your freezer in the kitchen overnight, and take it out. Now, you can give it to the chickens and let the chickens peck it away, or what you just do is, once it's been frozen, thaw it out and put it back in the hive. The bees will now sense the dead larvae and the dead mites in this frame. They'll clean it all out. They will take out all the dead larvae, all the dead mites from the entrance, and the queen will come back and lay eggs in here again. And when they're all capped, you can take this frame out again. This will physically remove quite a few mites from the hive. The problem with this is that unless you are conscientious and you keep a record of when this went into the hive and when it needs to come out, if you leave it in the hive and these drones emerge, so will the mites, and you actually end up with more mites in your hive than you do without it. But if you're determined to find ways of reducing mite level buildup, this is an effective way. And during the times when bees are likely to build drones, that is late May, here in Maine it'd be late May, June and July, you can effectively remove drones from the hive every 2.5 weeks or so. And in doing so, you'll remove quite a few of those mites. Again, it's very unlikely to stop the mites getting up to a level where they need treatment, but it will postpone it. So, drone brood removal. Other things that can be done are interrupting the brood cycle. Mites need brood in order to parasitize the brood in order to reproduce. So during the summer, we can interrupt the brood cycle in the hive. Now, if your hive swarms, your brood cycle is being interrupted in just this way. You'll go through a period of 2 or 3 weeks with no brood in the hive. If you have no brood in the hive, the mites can't reproduce, and actually the mite numbers drop quite significantly during that period. So for both the swarm that leaves the hive and the hive that issued the swarm, mite levels drop because they cannot reproduce on those adult bees. They need brood to reproduce, so mite levels will drop. And so that is why a colony that swarms several times is actually more likely to survive the winter without a mite treatment than any other hive, because in effect it's done a natural depletion of mites in the hive. Now, of course, we don't typically want, in Maine we've got such a short summer, we don't want an interruption in the brood cycle, but if you do want to do this artificially, you can do this. Take a little cage like this, hardwire cloth, and let's pretend that this is just simply a normal brood frame. If our queen is on here, we can take this cage and push it through the comb, and now the queen is trapped in there with some worker bees to feed her, but they can also feed her through the screen, and some emerging brood. But this has limited the queen so that she can now only lay in these cells. And once she's filled them up, there's nothing else that she can do. But this goes back into the hive, it's pushed all the way down to the plastic foundation. It won't work if you use wax foundation. It's got to be plastic, otherwise the bees will burrow through from the other side and let the queen out. But this will cage the queen, and you can leave the queen trapped in here for 3 weeks, and now you have interrupted the brood cycle entirely, bar this small square of brood here. And so this is a way that in some places they do this artificial trapping of the queen, and caging the queen so that she can't produce brood for a short period, but this way the queen is still in the hive and the hive still behaves normally, but the mite levels can drop. And this is now a perfect time to use a mite treatment, because now when you've got a brood-free period in the hive, this is an ideal time to zap them with oxalic acid or HopGuard, one of the more gentle treatments to get rid of those mites. There's a couple of other ways that you can reduce mites in the hive. This is not one that I've practiced myself, but you can get foundation which has got a much smaller cell. It's got a 4.9 millimeter cell instead of the standard 5.4 millimeter cell. For some reason, it was decided when commercial beekeeping started booming and artificial foundation was being made, that they found that if they made a larger cell size, it could actually result in bigger bees who produce more honey. And so 5.4 millimeter cells, which you have in all of your foundation, is actually not what you find in the wild. What you find in the wild is 4.9 millimeter. This larger cell means that the bees pupate for an extra 2 days. And so instead, in the wild, bees emerge on their 19th day. On normal foundation, they emerge on the 21st day. Now, this is not known whether it would have a major impact on mite levels, but it probably would, given that for 3 more days, the mites would preferentially go into drone larvae. It makes sense to me that small cell foundation would actually result in fewer mites in the hive, but you may also pay for that in terms of honey production and the robustness of those bees. It's not a practice that I'm familiar with and having done myself, so it's not really one that I can speak to with a great deal of knowledge. But it's out there, and there's the information for you to follow up if it's something that you want to follow up. Finally, and something more at our disposal, is choosing the genetics of our bee in the first place. Russian bees, for example, are known to have what we call hygienic behavior. They can sniff out and remove mites from developing larvae. There's various different types of cleaning and hygienic behaviors, which I'll not go into that sort of detail here, but by choosing strains of bee which have a reputation for being more mite resistant or more mite tolerant, you can improve your colony's chances of survival. Colonies, races that are known to have good or improved mite resistance are Russians. Saskatraz bees were bred specifically for mite tolerance. But in my opinion, having dealt with Saskatraz bees for 3 years now, they are by no means the finished article, but I've certainly found much better mite levels in my Saskatraz hives than I found in the corresponding periods with my previous Italian hives. So I think that they are considerably better than Italians on the whole for mite levels, and therefore knock-on effect survivorship. But by no means do I think that they're the finished article. Hopefully within years we will have more and more strains of bee which have a better and better mite tolerance and better still mite resistance. In my view, that's kind of the holy grail of bee breeding, is to produce bees that have real mite tolerance, and they take care of the problem for us, and we don't have to manage for low mite levels. The bees do it themselves. One day that'll be the case, but for now, sample your hives, use integrated pest management techniques to keep mite levels from building up, and use treatments when the samples indicate that it's time to treat, because you've hit a threshold at which it's going to become dangerous to let that threshold be exceeded, because the mites will build up to such an extent that the virus levels in the hive will kill your bees. I hope you found that useful. I'd suggest you go over that video again and go over the mite treatments video again and again until you've taken it on board. Please feel free to comment below. I hope you did find that helpful. My name is Peter Cowan. I'm the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.